This video will be part 2 for chapter 2 on Carl Jung for PSY 230 personality theory. In this part of the chapter, or this part of the presentation rather, we're going to be looking at how Jung described the structure of personality, and this will help you kind of get your head around the other side of Carl Jung. So last time I talked about the personality typology of introversion, extroversion, and the functional modes. This will, in this part of the presentation, we're really talking about a very different way that Jung talked about personality structure, and also a different way that Jung talked about functioning of personality. Kind of underneath the hood. In part 1, we were really talking about on the surface, what are people's traits like, and how do individual differences kind of play out in our everyday expressions of personality. In this part of the presentation, we're really going to be talking about more unconscious issues and more of the ways in which human beings are all alike. In their functioning. So we start with where Jung and Freud had some commonality, and that is in what Jung described as the personal unconscious. So in Freud's description of the unconscious, you had repressed material, things that you are hidden from your awareness, but they're accessible to some degree, either through dreams or other kinds of techniques that are used in psychoanalysis. For Jung, he defined the personal unconscious as, and this is similar to the Freudian definition of the unconscious, forgotten memories, repressed experiences, subliminals. Now, he argued that these aspects of the personal unconscious, they can be painful memories, they can be repressed traumas. They can also, the content of the personal unconscious can also be relatively unimportant things that are just dropped from awareness because they're not useful anymore. They can be dragged into what Freud called that preconscious state space. They can become temporarily accessible, for example. But they can just be unimportant things. So for Jung, he adds this idea that the personal unconscious can, in fact, involve issues that are important, that can become relevant in therapy, for example, or in psychoanalysis. But it can also involve things that just aren't all that important anymore. The personal unconscious can include elements of personality that never come to consciousness, in addition to things that can be accessed through intentional effort or through psychoanalysis. Now, for Jung, he spent much more of his theoretical time, his writing time, talking about things unrelated to the personal unconscious. For Freud, most of his thinking and his writing was spent talking about that personal unconscious. For Jung, he was much more interested in these metaphysical, spiritualistic elements that he believed were present in this thing called the collective unconscious. And if you recall the previous presentation, Jung and Freud really parted ways on this issue. These elements within the collective unconscious. Jung defined this construct of the collective unconscious as a repository of psychic material. And again, by psychic, he's not referring necessarily to ESP or skills that people might have in the psychic realm. He's talking about psychological material that, in this case, in the case of the collective unconscious, it's almost like he described it as a repository of species-based memories. So he he intimates in some ways that there's a genetic basis for this species level collective material, that it's shared from one element of the species to the next. So when your authors say it's a center of psychic material not derived from personal experience, he's suggesting that there's something about the human species that all humans have the ability to tap into, but we're not consciously aware of it. And he argues that that's why there are, across cultures and across religious traditions, the same stories are being told, the same images are being shared. In our mythologies, in our children's stories, in our songs, in our poetry, human beings have used a shared set of images, a shared set of motifs, a shared set of ideas, and that transcends individual experience. So the idea is, as your authors put it, you have content and images that appear to be shared by peoples across cultures and across time periods, and he argues that it reflects some collective evolutionary history. He argues that the collective unconscious is made up of these things called archetypes. And part of the challenge of studying Carl Jung is that some of the ideas that he proposes are difficult to translate from the language in which he wrote. But basically an archetype is what he referred to as an essence or a universal form. And since they're at the unconscious level, they're not things that you are consciously aware of, but they are familiar to us. So if we see an image of, say, a two-headed beast in mythology, and there are two-headed beasts, three-headed beasts, six-headed beasts, whatever, there are these kinds of mythological creatures in virtually every culture known to humankind. So he argues that if every culture has this kind of image in its storytelling, there's something essential about that. There's something archetypal about that that's saying something significant about who we are as human beings. Now, thoughts and feelings associated with these archetypes. So what I mean by thoughts and feelings, beliefs, ideas, values, but also emotions, fear, happiness, joy, arousal, all of those things can be felt or thought associated with these archetypes. We can't grasp or consciously act on the archetypes themselves, but we have thoughts and feelings that rise to the surface, that become conscious, that we can then tie to that deeper structure, human shared collective awareness. Now, these archetypes come in multiple forms. Most of the time, textbooks in personality theory are only going to give you a smattering. If you really got into Jungian psychology, you would, read some of the Jung in a good translation. You'll get a broader sense of just how many of these archetypes Jung believed existed. So we're only going to, touch the surface of what Jung thought. One way you can define an archetype is in terms of it being an inherited predisposition. One not perfect way of thinking about this is that's sort of analogous is an instinct, where humans will come into contact with wild animals, and those animals have an instinctive fear of what's new. Some species, like elephants, for example, early in human history, elephants did not have a fear of human beings. That fear had to evolve over time as humans started to hunt them. Now, elephants are fearful of humans. So Jung used that as an example of saying, over the course of evolution of a species, certain predispositions are acquired and they become woven into the genetics of that species, and are shared by all members of that species. He argued that there are also, psychological predispositions that are woven into the evolutionary history of us as a species, and they shape us. So he talked about these so-called primordial representations or images as being connected to instinctual energies. Now, Freud had these ideas about, psychological energy, things like libido or a death instinct. Jung deepened and broadened that idea, talking about instinctual energies within the collective unconscious. And he argued again that these are based on universal ideas, universal themes, universal worries, fears. So if you think back to all the childhood stories, all of those Disney movies, there are certain themes that are consistent across some of those stories. And the villains have certain images, the challenges, the problems, the life course challenges that people face in those children's stories. Jung argued that those are archetypal stories, and they should be paid attention to because they say something important about our humanity and about our psychology. He also, like Freud, was interested in dream imagery. He tended to depart from Freud, though, in arguing, Freud tended to see dreams as a manifestation of what's, the crises, the conflicts that are going on between the id and the superego, and sometimes they're directly connected to trauma experiences that people have had that are now representing neurotic problems in their lives. For Jung, he broadens this out. Dream content, he argued, is often laced with mythical imagery and spiritual themes, and they are, rising to this dream space in order to attempt to communicate with us as individuals, messages from that collective human unconscious. Archetypes in the Jungian system, as your authors put it, have a structure forming quality to them. And what that means is, underneath, if you think about structures, like Freud had id, ego, superego, he had preconscious, conscious, and unconscious spaces. And the id, ego, and superego were structures making up the human psyche. For Jung, the psyche, it has conscious elements, there are preconscious elements, there's a personal unconscious. The structure underneath all of that is the collective unconscious that is built out of archetypal images. Those archetypes are bipolar, meaning that there's one end. Imagine it as the spokes of a wheel. Our collective unconscious is a great big complicated wheel with spokes. The center is the ego archetype, or the self-archetype at the center, and the spokes lead out from it. Each spoke is a straight line from one end to another end of opposites. Jung was really big on these polar opposites. So each archetype is represented by these bipolar structures. He felt that archetypes are reflected in patterns. So we're particularly attracted to, as human beings, to things that reoccur. We have these experiences like deja vu experiences, and he argued that these were things we really needed to pay attention to. With the concept of synchronicity, for example, when we notice these patterns of reoccurrences that seem coincidental, he argued that's because your collective unconscious is drawing your attention to those synchronous patterns, and they're trying to tell you something important about you and how you need to move developmentally. Archetypes should be seen as forms. They don't necessarily have content of their own, and this is really hard to wrap your head around, and I get that. It takes some mental flexibility to get your head around the idea of archetypes. They are just sort of loosely formed psychological material. They're suggestions in a way. They don't have a particular hard and fast content, but they suggest to us meaningful things that can help us to move in particular directions, behaviorally, in our thoughts, in our emotions. When an archetype becomes active, it pushes our energy in certain directions. So, Jung gave simple examples, like you see a spider in a web. That web has a particular shape and form that we find aesthetically very, very interesting. Humans have been fascinated by the shape of spider webs from the beginning of time. We're also fascinated by things like snowflakes, patterns in clouds. When we see those and we find them attractive, he argued it's because they tap into some important archetypal form. And when we recognize those things in our everyday life, we're tapping that archetype and it releases energy. For Jung, he suggests that this is a way for us in our conscious lives to become aware of things that are developmentally significant for us. Now, this is kind of a one way that you can visually, because I'm a very visual thinker and things make more sense to me when I can see a picture of them. So when I mentioned that we have this collective unconscious that is analogous to a wheel with spokes, you have these diametrically opposed possibilities. So you have the sage, this wise creature who represents knowledge, which is opposite of the teasing jester, not particularly wise, based on pleasure. They are diametrically opposed forces that each have something kind of different to say about our experiences. So you have the knowledgeable wise one, you have the court jester, the trickster down here. The trickster connects to others in its own particular way, whereas the sage connects to our spiritual journey in its own particular way. You have the artist, the ruler, opposed from the magician and the hero. You have explorers and outlaws versus everyman and caregivers. These opposing forces, these images, you'll notice in our storytelling. Think about the Marvel universe and how there are wise elements, there are jester elements, there are everyman elements, there are explorer elements, there are caregivers, there are outlaws, and so on. There are demons, there are heroes. And all of these archetypal structures in our storytelling tell us something important about who we are as human beings. For Jung, he argued that we are our best selves when we embrace energy coming from all of them in dynamic balance. We have problems, we suffer, we become neurotic, we fail to grow when they are imbalanced. So if you lean too hard on your sage qualities and think that those are the all important and you should reject playfulness of the jester, you're out of balance and you're not allowing for play, you're not allowing for fun, for pleasure. If you overbalance in the direction of innocence and safety, you're losing the intimacy of love. and the pleasure that that can bring with it. If you are over focused on being in control and won't give anything but that, then you're unbalanced. So again, Jung, in his description of these archetypes and their presence within the collective unconscious, they don't exist in isolation. They are in dynamic opposition to one another. If a person is fully living and fully healthy, they are able to tap into the energies that are possible in the whole of the human species. They're able to tap into all of these things in different forms, in different ways. The ego, he argues, is the unifying archetype. So he talked about a couple of different forms of ego existence. There's the self that exists, in your everyday thoughts of who you are. But underneath, there is this major archetype called the ego. It is in a way, the portal into the collective unconscious, because it has elements that can rise into our conscious thoughts and into our conscious lives. But it also has this capacity to function as in an archetypal way and unify the energy coming from all of the other archetypes as possibilities. So part of what the ego does is it brings a sense of wholeness, of consistency, of direction to our conscious existence. It's selective, it's orderly. In many ways, this version of describing the ego that Jung is providing to us is very similar to how Freud defined the ego, but he gives the ego more conscious control. For Freud, the ego is just desperately trying to put a lid on the anxiety and uses defenses to play catch up and to mediate the relationship between the id and the superego. Jung gives the ego more to do. He finds the ego defenses to be, just a petty time consumer of our everyday lives. If we are fully functioning, our ego can do more. Our ego can be selective. It can be something that chooses what to think about, what to feel, what to recall, and what to do. The ego does deal with threats, and he, as your authors put it, the ego tends to fight against or oppose anything that might threaten the integrity of our consciousness, our balance, being something that Jung really talked a lot about. So the ego works to convince us that we need to be planful, that we need to analyze our experiences. In other words, we need to be thoughtful. We need to be on the lookout for things that might tap into our archetypal collective unconscious. The ego, for Jung, comes out of the unconscious as an archetype itself, with the goal of bringing together our various experiences, our memories. And it's a linkage between the unconscious and the conscious mind. Now we need to look at some other examples of archetypes. The ego is a special kind of archetype. It has unconscious properties at the center of that wheel image, but it also has conscious properties. The archetypes that I'm going to talk about now are unconscious. Through the ego, they have conscious expression. The persona is what we present to the world, and it's like a shapeshifter. We can decide how to present ourselves in a social context, and you do this all the time. You change the self that you present based on who you're with and what you're doing. The self that you present to say, a parent at your home is very different from the persona that you present to your best friends or to your life partner, for example. The persona can have both negative and positive aspects. You can have a persona that you present for a very manipulative purpose to get what you want. That would be a negative aspect. You could have an authentic persona that you present to someone that you're very comfortable with and safe with. That can be more positive. You can have a persona that's threatening. You can have a persona that's quite kind and caring. Both of those are functional. We use them when we feel like we need to. It can also reflect neurosis. You can have a persona that's very negatively built and unhealthy in its expression. A dominant persona can be very smothering and controlling, and people who identify with their persona too strongly can become quite superficial. So in neurosis, a persona that sort of takes over who you are becomes inauthentic. If you think, I have to be a certain way, think about the way people curate themselves online, their Instagram self, if you will. If that becomes who they think they are, you're over-identifying with the persona and it becomes too dominant. That's a neurotic form of functioning. On the positive side, the persona can perform an ego defense function. It can help you see yourself positively, can protect you from the slings and arrows of your past experiences and your present crises. So it can protect the psyche from what's going on in your social world, in very much the same way that ego defense was described by Freud. Jung sometimes called the persona a conformity archetype, because basically what you're doing with your persona is moving from one social situation to another social situation and modifying how you present in those social situations. Think about the concept of passing. When we think of people, say LGBTQIA people, who find themselves needing to pass in a heterosexually dominant world, that's what Jung means by a conformity archetype here. But he argues we all do it in various situations. Sometimes it's really easy. Sometimes it's very hard. If you find yourself in a very alien kind of situation, maybe outside of your comfort zone in a cultural context, the persona has a harder job. And it has to be very, very divergent from who you really see yourself as. So it has to do a harder job at passing than it would otherwise. Now the shadow, and we are, in our cultural storytelling, we are addicted to shadow figures. We have so many of these shadow images. Batman is a famous example. But all of these kind of super anti-heroes that we have, I'm thinking of, a recent one of these stories, the Venom mythology, where you have a character that dresses or is taken over by an inner demon. The Hulk is another shadow figure. Hulk smash is a shadow archetype image. We have lots of stories built on the archetype of the shadow. So the shadow is an archetypal form that is pushed out of our conscious awareness. It represents this dark imagery, hence shadow. The contents include sort of desires and memories that have been, or that social norms suggest are incompatible with how we should conduct ourselves in our everyday lives. Sometimes the shadow represents a quite violent, impulsive, powerful force that goes against community standards or social rules and norms. But it is quite attractive and powerful. So the things that the Batman can do are things that his alter ego, its persona, can't, because they are seen as inappropriate. They're wrong. They go beyond the superego's rules, to use the Freudian terminology. So the persona, in some ways, is the play actor, the one that goes along with social standards to fit in. The shadow says, to heck with that, Sometimes you just have to do what needs to be done, and it might be quite violent in its form. So the shadow is often described in terms of negative tendencies that people would like to deny they have. You know, we would like to deny that we have the capacity for murder, that we have the capacity for being quite evil in our own psyche. But that potential is always there. And for Jung, he argued that there's quite a bit of untapped potential in our shadow. You know, that's why frequently in our nightmares, in our dreams, we see ourselves doing very bad things. And, you know, Jung said, you know, pay attention to that. That's your shadow talking. That means that somehow in your conscious life, you are repressing powers that you have that are quite important for you to pay attention to. Now, does that mean you should run around murdering people? Absolutely not. That's not what Jung is arguing. He's arguing that perhaps you are repressing things and pushing things out of your awareness that are powerful, that you could benefit from. And that includes some of these more animal qualities. We may think they're uncouth or they're inappropriate, but maybe you're denying yourself something that is powerful that you could access. The shadow often shows up in dreams as these primitive, hostile, repellent figures. Trolls, demons, ghosts, vile things that creep up and sometimes are shown ripping us up in our dreams. The shadow, you know, it has for Jung this quality of trying to destroy us unless we embrace it. Think of all the storytelling that involves transformation. So werewolves, nice people, they get bit by another werewolf and they, without wanting to, turn into something else. Or the Hulk gets angry and turns into a giant green chest thumping thing that wishes to destroy all in its path. But remember how in that Marvel universe, I think it's not Marvel, the superhero universe, the Hulk narrative, how the story arc has changed. He ends up being balanced. He ends up being both Banner and Hulk simultaneously. So that's very Jungian imagery, where the healthiest version of Banner embraces the Hulk and now has Hulk's strength, but Banner's brains. That's a mixture, a healthy mixture of persona and shadow. Jung argues that the shadow is most problematic. It creates the most trouble for us when we ignore it. So he would argue that people become psychopathic, that they become sociopathic, they become quite evil if they ignore the shadow too much. So, you know, Jung's message was ignore the shadow at your peril. When it's completely ignored, you can either become a super shallow manipulative persona, or you can become dead evil in some ways. The repressed portions of the shadow are a part of ourselves. So ignoring them is ignoring something essential about your humanness. Now, I'm going to play this video, as I've said in many, in my other lectures. When I have these embedded videos, the audio might be quite poor on this presentation, but if you go to the D2L page, I'll make sure to link this video. It's also on the playlist for this class. So what Jung is talking about here, and his accent is very hard to on, especially on a poor quality video recording from the time when he was being interviewed here. He argues, like I was saying before, that you ignore the shadow, and when you ignore it, when you repress it, that is what's responsible for the evils of mankind, in his words. Remember how I mentioned, Freud has this really dark image of humanity. Well, Jung was living in the same time period. Europe, during that time frame, when Jung was a child, World War I was going on. It was a brutal, horrifying war. And then, when he's older, World War II happens. And, the horrors that humans do to each other is something that both Jung and Freud were trying to explain psychologically as doctors, as also thinkers. So for Jung, he takes a much more metaphysical approach here. The shadow, when it is ignored, permits us to find ways to do these horrors to each other. Now, another set of opposing archetypes are the inherent feminine and masculine capacities of human beings, which he labeled the anima and the animus. I include this image here. Remember how I said that Jung was very fascinated by many, many Eastern cultural images and ideas, and he was particularly enamored of Indian religions and philosophies. He used a lot of these images, these dualistic images that had masculine and feminine qualities on their exterior. So if you look at mythology, you look at religious iconography, there are lots of these images of the male and female combined into one organism. For Jung, he talked about the anima as the feminine possibility expressed in males, and the animus is the masculine possibility as expressed in the female. So within all of us, regardless of our anatomy, regardless of our gender identity, each of us possesses the feminine possibility and the masculine possibility. Now he argued, given his time frame, we didn't have LGBTQ conversations going on, certainly when Jung was alive and when he was writing. So he looks at this and says, okay, your anatomy is going to bias you in the direction of a strong archetypal expression in one direction or the other. So in the male, the animus is already going to be strong and reinforced by cultural norms. In the female, the anima is already going to be quite strong. So you'll be biased in its expression. At the same time, for the male of the species, the male is challenged to accept messages coming from the collective unconscious in the form of the feminine, the anima. And females are challenged to listen to and embrace the masculine possibilities in the animus. He argued that in the dreams of males who he saw in psychoanalysis, or in analysis rather, they would report dreams in which they were transformed into something quite clearly feminine, and they found this anxiety-provoking, terrifying, to see themselves as female. What Jung saw this as was the anima, which has been repressed, that you're fighting against, is something you need to allow to come forward and influence you, because dynamic balance is required for full human individuation in the Jungian model. So for the male, he has a challenge of needing to embrace some feminine possibilities in order to be balanced, to be fully balanced. So, for example, for a man to be able to love fully his intimate partner, whoever that intimate partner is, he is going to need to embrace some of his feminine possibility. Same goes for women. For females, there's the masculine possibility. So his patients who were women often told him of dream imagery in which they were transformed into males, into especially warriors, with big muscles and strength and power and control. And he argued for women who were seeing that message in their imagery, in their dream imagery, they need to pay attention to their masculine possibilities, to their power, to their strength, to be fully functional. He argued that this dynamic of the anima and the animus archetypes, it becomes a focal point for psychological material that doesn't fit your socialization, is either a male or female in your cultural context. So he argued that we all struggle with what we're expected to be as men and women versus the psychologically balanced embracing of the opposite. So, he's often described as somehow pushing this notion that we're all at our heart bisexual. That's not exactly what he said. That's sort of a popular interpretation of Jungian psychology that doesn't really jive particularly well with what he actually wrote. Instead, what he's really trying to encourage us to see is that we have feminine and masculine potentials within all of us, and that we are at our best when we balance them and embrace all of their possibilities, instead of, really intentionally suppressing one or the other. So we tend to unbalance ourselves by having really restrictive gender identities. He argued that we would be better off if we were more flexible in terms of our understanding of the possible influences of both. He argues that this gender thing, the anima-animus dichotomy, it is an important filter. Your authors describe it as a primary mediator between unconscious and conscious processes. He felt that the way the human species has evolved, that he was a medical doctor first before he became an analyst. He felt that gender kind of becomes the lens through which everything gets filtered. So he felt the anima-animus dichotomy was really critical as a way that we orient ourselves in our social world.
Or at least a good imitation.
So what Jung is talking about there in his description of when you see, so the man, he sees a woman in his conscious life, it's going to trigger, if he finds her particularly alluring or attractive, what that sensation of attraction has also a deep connection to his feminine potential. So it's going to activate that archetype and rise to the surface. Now, in an unbalanced individual, it can become possessive, it can become controlling, can become troubling and anxiety provoking for the person. So, he argues that the more tapped into your opposite you are, the more capable you are of having balanced relationships with other people. Otherwise, they become obsessive and filled with anxiety. Now, the self, and again, I'm a very visual thinker, and pictures help me. This is one artist's rendering of how these major archetypes are laid out in the collective unconscious. This wasn't a drawing that Jung made. This is a Jungian psychologist's rendering of how these various elements interact. The self is a central archetype where you've got, it has a very integrative function. It's not wholly conscious, it's not wholly unconscious. It has an integrative role in connecting ego and shadow and persona and anima and animus in our whole self. It's very hard to explain in concrete terms because it's not a concrete thing. It's a central archetype that represents, as your authors put it, order and totality. In some ways, it has its fingers in all of the archetypal elements within the collective unconscious, but it also is capable of integrating our current conscious experiences with our personal unconscious content, as well as the collective experience of humanity. He talked about it in terms of centeredness. When your anima and animus are equivalent in their, I hesitate to say influence, but when you are, if say you're female and you are fully capable of tapping into your animus, the self is it allows you to do that. Ego does it in some respects, but ego has this sort of protective function that is more connected to the persona and integration with the shadow. The self is in the middle of all of it. And he felt that, working on the self and its integrative capacity for centering us was a critical goal of the individuation process in development and of the purpose of analysis when people were working with him as patients. He argued that the self-archetype can, in fully functioning people, very self-developed people, can bring conscious and unconscious awareness together. He argued that it has a harmonizing function that allows for mutual expressions of what appear to be diametrically opposed elements like persona and shadow, anima and animus. The self allows us to harmonize those expressions rather than seeing them in opposition, pulls them into dynamic balance. So the self, when we are tapping into it, it may come to us in dreams, or we may become captivated by images. It tends to present itself, in Jung's opinion, in these impersonal forms like circles, mandalas, sometimes in the form of stones or crystals, but often in these objects that we find visually appealing. But they can also take the form of storytelling images. Like we have a fondness for family images, couples or couples with a child. We have a fondness for threes. We certainly do. We like images that have three components, especially parents with a child, or like the triarchic image of the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, for example, in Christianity. There are lots of those kinds of iconographies within religious traditions, for example. And that concludes part 2 of chapter 2.